Good evening to all of you. Thank you, Stephanie, for welcoming me here. I have some 35 pages of manuscripts. So how long do we have? How long do you want to stay here? I'm hoping to leave most of that lecture manuscript where it is right now and occasionally glance at it, but talk to you about the issue of significant concern to me. It's a slice of the announced topic, and in particularly, I have become over the years very much interested in the question whether religious exclusivists can embrace pluralism as a political project. Relationship between religious exclusivism and political pluralism as one of the central issues, not just in our country here, but also globally. And the first time when this issue hit me very explicitly and clearly was when I was teaching a course on faith and globalization with ex-Prime Minister Tony Blair. It was our first session of the first time we taught this course, and it was on 9/11 that our first session was taking place. And after the first lecture, first by myself briefly and then by Prime Minister Tony Blair, about the ambivalence of faiths, of faiths that are inspiring many people to live great lives, admirable lives, at the same time inspiring also many to abominable deeds. Exploring this issue, first person who raised the question was a Muslim graduate student at Yale University. And he said, but is it possible for religious exclusivists, which is what many Christians are, which is what many Muslims are, is it possible for religious exclusivists to actually live in peace with one another, living under the same roof? And that question has stayed throughout the course, and indeed every single time we taught this course, it has repeated itself as one of the fundamental questions that decides about the way in which we engage each other in this complex world in which we live. So let me say just a few words about why this question matters, about globalization processes. Let me then say a few words about, give you defined terms, exclusivism and pluralism, both religious and political. And then I'll state my thesis from the start. Namely, the thesis is that I believe that religious exclusivists indeed can embrace pluralism as a political project, and can embrace pluralism as a political project not just out of pragmatic reasons, because they need to achieve certain goals, and under certain conditions it might be better for them to do so, but they can embrace pluralism as a political project from the deep resources of their faith itself. But before I can argue for this thesis very briefly, and I'll argue it on the basis of a historical example of who I call to be the granddaddy of political pluralism, namely Roger Williams. Not too far from here, left is Massachusetts Bay Colony. That well, not left. Left isn't quite the right word for it, right? He was banished, had to flee. Otherwise, he would have been banished and deported to England, where his life was threatened, right? But before I do that, I need to give some space to the critics of this thesis, and two of them I want to mention, and that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau at the end of his social book, Social Contract, and then Karl Popper. Some of you are familiar, I'm sure, with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, maybe fewer of you with Karl Popper, who was one of the great philosophers of science of the mid-20th century, and who's written the book entitled Open Society and Its Enemies. And it's in this book that he addresses this question as well. And finally, also I want to engage briefly those who would think that the whole question actually may be of some academic but not of very much practical interest, for the very simple reason that the globalization processes as modernity as a whole is likely to erode strong religious sensibilities and therefore will take care of the problem on its own. So we don't have to worry too much about it. Okay, that's roughly the terrain we're going to cover. Is that roughly clear? So first, globalization. Let me first define my terms, and then I'll go into globalization processes. By religious exclusivism, I mean simply people who believe that their faith is the true faith, that their way of life is, that the way of life that the faith sketches is a life-giving way of life that is leading to a life of flourishing today in this world and to eternal life in the coming world. I don't mean to say that these are the folks who don't think that there's any truth in other religions or in other ways of life, but that their truth kind of trumps any other truth. When there's a conflict, it's their truth that kind of counts, in a sense, right? There are wide varieties of religious exclusivism. We don't need to necessarily explore all of those. Political pluralists are basically the way I use the term, are the folks who think that only a particular group, that a particular group ought to be privileged within a society. That can be a wide variety of particular groups, but basically those who deny that all people, irrespective of their comprehensive accounts of life, they don't have the same equal voice and equal rights in a given polity. Religious pluralists, on the other hand, are folks who believe that all religions are roughly equally true and they're roughly equally effective as ways of bringing people to encounter with God and to eternal destiny. Often what you have is this image of a circle, and the divine, God, is in the circle, in the middle of the circle, and religions are perceived as being along the edges of that circumference of that circle, equally, each equidistant from the center itself, each their own specific way to reach God. And finally, political pluralism, way I use it, describes, well, the kinds of political arrangements in which the state is neutral with respect to overarching interpretations of life, and each citizen, no matter what overarching perspective on life he or she espouses, has equal voice in the affairs of the state. I know that the issues are much more complex than this, but this is very roughly the way in which I use those terms. And often the sensibility, general sensibility, is that if you are a religious exclusivist, you're going to lean to being political exclusivist as well. And in order for you to be a political pluralist, you kind of have to be also religious pluralists, because if you're a religious exclusivist, you will in one way or the other try to impose your views upon other folks. So that there's affinity, if you can say, between religious exclusivism and political exclusivism, and that there is affinity between religious pluralism and political pluralism. I want to suggest that there may be such affinities. Now, if you look at the history of Christians' relationship to the state, well, for many years, religious exclusivism went hand in hand with political exclusivism. So that we have some argument to make why that it isn't paradigmatic. But that's precisely what I'm trying to do here, trying to suggest that notwithstanding the long history of the Christian association between religious exclusivism and political exclusivism, that kind of relationship need not obtain given the circumstances which I will describe. That's not true simply of the Christian faith, it's true also of other faiths as well. So, that much about definitions. Now, why does this question matter so much? Well, it matters so much because we live in a globalized world in which we, as I put it very colloquially, people of many different persuasions and religions live under the same roof. It used to be that we could sequester people into groupings, right? So that cuius regio eius religio, the person who, the ruler, if ruler has a particular religion, then in this his domain or her domain, that religion is going to rule, and you can build walls between people. All these walls, as a result of globalization, have fallen down, and we increasingly live very much in an intermingled world. Not just intermingled world, but intermingled world in which faiths are numerically growing and are politically assertive. Religion is not withering away, and religion is not being locked in the privacy of people's heart. Rather, religion is becoming public. And that's connected, I think, with many things, but certainly it's connected also with the popularity of the democratic ideal throughout the globe. No matter what religion that is, democratic ideal holds is a significant value to most religious people. Well, what do religious people who hold democracy as important do when they think about public realm? Well, they try to bring their own convictions into that public realm, hence partly the explanation for assertiveness of religions in the world today. The final feature of religions in this intermingled world in which we live is that majority of the religious folks are religious exclusivists. In nominally Christian Western countries, statistics that I have read is something like 55% of Christians are exclusivists. In highly vibrant communities in the third world, 87% of Christians are religious exclusivists. In moderate Muslim Christian countries like Turkey and Indonesia, 60% of Muslims are exclusivists, religious exclusivists. In more strict Islamic countries or majority Muslim countries, percentage is much higher. Even Hindus, who sometimes are said to be very tolerant and non-exclusivistic and pluralistic, our majority of them are religious exclusivists. I haven't done the count really carefully, and I'm sure that those of you who work in sociology will tell me, even if you do it very carefully, you can't do it because we can't know, because our polling is atrocious, not just in the countries where it's done systematically, but especially in places where it's done very haphazardly, right? But rough estimates, if these figures are right, rough estimates, you end up with something close to 2 billion people who are religious exclusivists. Now, if religious exclusivists cannot be political pluralists, in the context of a globalized world, we are facing major difficulty. Now, you may want to say, well, okay, so we can try to persuade religious exclusivists to become religious pluralists, so that they can also then be political pluralists, right? Chances of you succeeding in this are close to zero, right? Because religious exclusivists first aren't going to be necessarily open to the arguments of this sort, and even those who are open to arguments of this sort, it's not clear to me that the best philosophical arguments are actually on the side of religious pluralism, and they aren't on the side of religious exclusivism. Hope of change from religious exclusivism, majority to religious pluralism, is close to zero. The other option, then, is kind of secular exclusion of religious folks from public realm, right? If you can't turn them into religious pluralists so that they become political pluralists, well, we have to keep them at bay from the political processes. But keeping folks at bay from political processes, as we've seen throughout the 20th century, is a bloody business. It involves certainly oppression and in many cases has involved a violent suppression of many people, certainly violation of human rights. So I think that's the reason why I believe that this issue, whether religious exclusivists can be political pluralists, is so incredibly important. So can they? Let me just first introduce two critics. And the first critic is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Toward the end of his classic text, The Social Contract, written in 1762, which is a text about reconciliation of individual freedom and the power of the state, Rousseau states, "Those who distinguish civil intolerance from theological intolerance are, in my opinion, mistaken. The two kinds of intolerance are inseparable. If you're, in my terms, if you're a religious exclusivist, you're going to be political exclusivist as well." Now, how does Rousseau support this claim? Well, here's what he writes immediately after the quote that I've just given to you. "It is impossible to live in peace with people whom we believe to be damned. To love them would be to hate God who punishes them. It is absolutely necessary to reclaim them or to punish them. Wherever theological intolerance is allowed, it cannot but have some effect in civil life, and as soon as it has any effect in civil life, the sovereign is no longer sovereign even in secular affairs. From that time, the priests are the real masters. The kings are their officers." So basically, it's an argument from exclusivity, religious exclusivity with regard to salvation. If you think that folks are going to be damned who are next to you, if you are serious about your faith, you're going to try to do something about it, right? You're going to either punish them, as God will punish them in the future life, or you're going to try to somehow reclaim them. Either way, Rousseau claims you're going to force them to do something that they otherwise would not want to do, and you're going to want to take also the whole apparatus of the state in order to help you in this regard. Now, there are different ways in which we can respond to Rousseau, but maybe the simplest ways to show that he's wrong is to point to the many exclusivists who do, in fact, live in peace with those who they believe will be damned. They travel with them on trains and on airplanes. Occasionally, sometimes you have a threat, right? But, I mean, they do travel on the airplanes. They work with them in offices and on construction sites. They sit with them around kitchen tables. They make love to them, raise children with them. It happens all the time, right? But maybe if we respond this way, maybe we are kind of skirting the real issue. Rousseau might respond back and say, well, maybe you're talking about inconsistent exclusivists, right? Who feel better than they think and who act better than their convictions are. If they were consistent, if they wanted to align their behavior with God's behavior, then they would try to do something about it. They would create a problem also within the state. And one can then, in response to that, list examples of many, I think, mainstream Christian exclusivists who would reject Rousseau's proposition and who would suggest that one is commanded by God to love one's neighbor, and that love command is universal. It applies to friend and to foe, to good and to evil, to saved and to damned. To love the damned is not to hate God, but to obey God and to emulate God, who makes the sun to shine on good and on evil. And in any case, since God hates nobody, people aren't damned because God hates them, but because implicitly or explicitly, in some way, they hate, quote unquote, God, or are indifferent to God. We could go back and forth with Rousseau, but I think most important objection from my perspective is to look at the consequences of Rousseau's position. Since religious exclusivism is socially pernicious, it ought to be disallowed, Rousseau thinks. And then he writes, now that there is, and there can be no longer any exclusive national religion, we should tolerate all those which tolerate others, so far as their dogmas have nothing contrary to the duties of the citizens. But whosoever dares to say, outside the church no salvation, ought to be driven from the state, unless the state be the church and the prince be the pontiff. Such a dogma is proper only in a theocratic government. In any other, it is pernicious. So if religious exclusivists are intolerant, right? If the social exclusivism leads upon the heels of religious exclusivism, what you got to do is you got to exclude the exclusivists. And so in a strange way, exclusivists become object of suppression so that the state can be preserved, state which embodies the duties of the citizen. Now the duties of the citizen have become a new religion in the name of which you are excluding others. I think the lesson from Rousseau is probably this, that the critics of religious exclusivism who insist on a tight connection between religious and political exclusivism very easily turn into exclusivists themselves. Now that's bad news in a world full of religious exclusivists. So now that's about, Rousseau was about exclusivism with regard to salvation. You recall that he was, the central piece of his argument was, if God considers somebody to be damned, you'll consider, religious exclusivists will consider that person to be damned, and the consequences will follow. Now, other folks who talk about this issue, they don't zero in so much on the question of salvation, but they zero in on the nature of truth claims, on the truth itself. So underlying religious exclusivism's claims about the way of life and eternal destiny, about salvation and so forth, is exclusivism with regard to religious truth and the access to that religious truth. Now, all major world religions, and that's true also of Christianity, are what sometimes the students of religion call secondary religions. Primary religions are religions that have grown over the centuries in limited locales, culturally conditioned, and they're primarily ritual religions with elements of wisdom in them. Secondary religions, which emerged during the so-called axial age, are religions that have set themselves over against those primary religions. And for all of these, the gesture of rejection, gesture of contestation of what is out there, in monotheist case, as idolatry, is fundamental. For instance, if you read in the Old Testament, the first commandment is formulated in negative terms. You shall have no other God, right? That's a rejection of other gods, right? Similarly, first pillar of Islam is there is no God but God. So the distinction between true and false religion is fundamental to certainly all monotheist faiths, but also other faiths from the axial period. And what's also important for those faiths is, certainly for Christianity, certainly for religions of the book, is reliance on special revelation. Now, the idea of revelation itself is the idea that religious truth is not something that you can sit and come up with out of the brilliance of your own internal insight. Or religious truth is not such that you can observe the world carefully and then come up with the insight, but rather that you need the light of revelation. They're revealed religions. And now, if they're revealed religions and revealed truth, then only those who have access to revealed truth special access to revealed truth, can embrace that truth, right? It's not accessible to everyone equally, to everyone's reason. And it's precisely at that point that critics of religion, of exclusivist religions, set their criticism. The idea is that this particular relationship that faiths have to truth make them essentially intolerant. They divide then the world into those who have the revelation and those who don't have the revelation, and there's no easy way to bridge between them. One of the critics of all faiths and all ideologies in this regard, as I mentioned earlier, is Karl Popper. His book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. It's a book which was written at an interesting time. It was a book written between 1935 and 1943. Happy years of the world, right? And he was a Jew from Vienna, living in exile in New Zealand, and observing from afar what was happening in the world at that time. And then he contrasts in this book the attitude of rationalist attitude and irrationalist attitude. And rationalist attitude is basically attitude of listening to critical arguments, learning from experience, a sense that I may be wrong and I can be enriched by your efforts in search for truth, and we together in these efforts will come closer to truth. And essential then to rationality in his particular case is respect for the force of the argument. Force of the argument decides, right? But he says as irrationalists, we think with our blood. Blood and, what is it, Blut and Boden? What's that in English, blood? What's the Nazi slogan? Blood and soil, right, exactly. Blut and Boden, right? If you irrationalists, you think with your blood. You think with your class. You think with your race. You think by God's grace rather than judging thoughts on their own merits. And such reliance on passions and authority divides people into two, friend and foe, compatriots and aliens, believers and unbelievers, and the consequences are pernicious. The big villain for Popper was Plato, actually. His whole first volume was dedicated to Plato and to the philosophers that follow, particularly Plato, Hegel, and Marx. Those are the great villains in his story. But all irrationalists are, and that's the point that I wish to make here. And if religious folks would respond, as many of us would, well, we too use reason, right? Popper has a ready answer. And he would say, well, you use reason up to a certain point. After that point, the reason's use gives way to claims of revelation, claims of authority, and therefore you are basically an irrationalist. As an irrationalist, you will not be able to be egalitarian. Egalitarianism and irrationalism sit very uneasily together. And therefore, you will have to, your embrace of your faith will tend to make you treat other people as lesser than yourself. What's the response to Karl Popper. Well, I think a long response would have to be, and I'm not sure that we can give a full response in the confines of the lecture. But basically, it's a debate about the use of reason, whether he's right that you can kind of reason goes all the way down to the bottom, and that would be the debate that would need to be carried on with him. But my third example that I want to mention now, not so much a person who would say that being a religious exclusivist will make you into political exclusivist. It's rather a person who might argue that this whole endeavor that which I'm undertaking now, is of trying to show that religious exclusivism and political pluralism can go together, is superfluous. And basically that is the idea that globalization processes are turning all religious people into pluralists, and they're turning us all into pluralists by simply pushing us to live together under the same roof in close proximity with people who are of different persuasions and different faiths. Peter Berger, here from your neighborhood, in a book, Far Glory, has argued that social pluralism erodes religious exclusivism and leads to religious pluralism. And the way it does is by what he calls cognitive contamination. And here's how he puts it. The thought obtrudes that one's traditional ways of looking at the world may not be the only plausible ones, that maybe those other people have a point or two. The worldview that until now was taken for granted is opened up, very slightly at first, to a glimmer of doubt. This opening has a way of expanding rapidly. The end point might be pervasive relativism. So basically, it's an argument from social psychology, and it's an argument you live with others, and over time you learn to appreciate them as people. You realize that their beliefs are not utterly false, and their ways of living not utterly pernicious, and eventually you conclude that their truth is as good as yours. Those are the kind of secularizing effects and relativizing effects of pluralism. Now, interestingly enough, Peter Berger in the same article has said, well, once that process goes to a certain degree, then it kind of bounces back. Because one thing people very much abhor is relativism. And so when the point comes when the relativism kind of starts kicking in, then you search for authority figures. Suddenly, authoritarianism and exclusivism become again plausible. But I think more important argument against Peter Berger is that in many situations of actual pluralism of religions, plurality of faiths, religions have not lost on vitality, but have actually become more vital. And the best examples of such situation is United States and India, right? Where religious pluralism has not eroded the strength of religious convictions, to the contrary. Okay, so the question then still becomes, is it possible for religious exclusivists then, given Rousseau and given Popper's criticism, is it possible for religious exclusivists to be political pluralists? And I think that the best response to that question is to point to the originator of political pluralism, and I would want to argue that at the origins of Western political pluralistic tradition lie religious figures. It's certainly not Locke. It's Roger Williams in this country, and it's Thomas Helwys, the early Baptist in England. Let me just say a few words about Roger Williams, and then I will conclude. 16th century Puritan father of political pluralism. At the origin of Western political pluralism lie firm convictions held by religious exclusivists about religious liberty and separation of church and state. Convictions that were so powerful that the people who held them not only preached and wrote about them, but worked to create political institutions that would embody and reinforce them. That's particularly significant about Roger Williams. Thomas Helwys has basically said everything at the theoretical level what Roger Williams has said so far as I could tell, but he hasn't attempted actually to establish a state in which practices separation of church and state. So, first and most prominent of such folks, a number of others could be mentioned, was Roger Williams. And he was an intransigent defender of religious truth, if there ever was one. He was a religious exclusivist. Most of us aren't as sturdy in our beliefs as Roger Williams was. Now, if one needed the proof that religious exclusivists can be totalitarian political exclusivists, Massachusetts Bay Colony furnishes it abundantly. In the famous sermon titled A Model of Christian Charity, it's a very important document, right? John Winthrop, its first government, sketches a vision of the colony as a city upon a hill. The city was the New Jerusalem, and the New Jerusalem was the city dedicated to God and to obeying God's laws. But given who human beings are, how difficult it is for us to obey God's laws, we needed a bit of help. And the chief role of the state, one of the chief roles of the government, was to enforce those laws, including watching over purity of religious observance. Flogging, mutilation, such as cutting off ears and cutting out of tongues, and in the case of adultery, idolatry, and blasphemy, execution. Those were some of the punishments for disobedience. State was supposed to be a nursing father of the church, and a nursing father could be quite stern chap. You know, when I read these things and then compare what's going on in the Muslim world today, I say, well, wait a second, Taliban government at the beginnings of American experiment? Delete this from my comments. Comes too close to home here. But it would it would be interesting to make the comparisons of the relationship between convictions, religious convictions, and how they translate in the role of the government that you have in some of the contemporary, more conservative Muslim Brotherhood kinds of accounts of the role of relationship between religion and politics, and what you had in Massachusetts Bay. By the way, Massachusetts Bay was not an exception. That was a rule. What's surprising is that Puritans who have fled religious persecution established a state who practice exactly the kind of religious persecution from which they have fled. And the reason they've done that is because basically they haven't changed the paradigm. What they have changed is simply they have said, well, we don't have the right to practice the right religion. We know what the right religion is. We're going to impose our right religion that is here. And I think the genius of Roger Williams was that he changed, was willing to change, able to change the whole paradigm. When Williams arrived to the colony in February of 1631, difficult times for the colony these were, right? First winter. Its leaders received him as a godly and zealous preacher. He was 28 years of age, and he was offered one of the most important positions in a deeply religious English America. He was to be the teacher, a kind of resident religious thinker in the Boston church. Now, to their stunned surprise, Williams refused the great honor. For him, the Boston Puritans were not separate enough. 5 years later, just a few months before they founded Harvard College, the magistrate banished Williams from the colony. What was his unpardonable offense? He advocated the seditious doctrine that magistrates had no right to enforce obedience to the first table of the law, the portion of Ten Commandments which regulates relationship between human beings and God. Later on, he wrote something like a 400-page long book. And in that book, he defended his position. And right at the beginning, he put some theses. And one of these theses, central to his book, was the following. It is the will and command of God that since the coming of his Son, the Lord Jesus, a permission of the most paganish, Jewish, Turkish, or anti-Christian consciousness and worships be granted in all nations and countries. The permission of these worships will be granted in all countries. And they're only to be fought with that sword which is only in soul matters able to conquer. And that sword is the Word of God. Now, a person who preceded him and from whom Roger Williams, if I see things rightly, took quite a bit of material, was Thomas Helwys. But no one before Williams have ever argued for such radical freedom of conscience. Indeed, it'll take a while before anybody will argue later on. Even John Locke, in his book on toleration, doesn't tolerate all those whom Roger Williams will tolerate, right? Why should the conscience of absolutely every person be free? Because all humans are equal. And forced worship stings in God's nostrils. The government, therefore, has no right to compel anyone to worship rightly. Conversely, church has no right to avail itself of the state's instrument of compulsion. A true mark of a false church is to persecute. Now, my point that I wish to make here is that Roger Williams was an unrepented religious exclusivist. With absolute faith in the Bible, with absolute faith in his own interpretation of it, he nonetheless believed it monstrous to compel another person to believe what he or anyone else believed, or to compel conformity to anyone else's belief. And he held this view for religious reasons, not simply for political reasons. And that seems to me central to proper understanding of the relationship of religious exclusivism and political pluralism, to the possibilities of religious exclusivism with regard to political pluralism. It is possible. Just because you are highly committed, just because you think that respect of conscience is a value to be advocate of political pluralism, even though you are a religious exclusivist. Now, I could go on. I think that the example of religious exclusivists who are political pluralists, very good, prominent example, is in fact the religious right in this country. I myself don't belong to religious right, wouldn't class myself there, but I'm persuaded by arguments, especially John Shields has written a book on the democratic virtues of the religious right. That too, I think, is a very significant indication of the possibility of that. Now, the big question for us is that simply a Christian phenomenon, or can it be transferred to other faiths and religions? That's going to be an argument which we would have to further make. But at least in the case of Christian religious exclusivism, which again for centuries has been connected with political totalitarianism, it was possible for explicitly religious reason to embrace pluralism as a political project. That's as much as I want to say for tonight, and I'm looking forward to hearing my respondents. Thank you.
We're going to have three respondents. Dr. Baycoat will go first, followed by Dr. Brink, and then Dr. Strongs.
Good evening. So, seeing that this is a Kuyper lecture, I thought I would ask the question, well, what might Kuyper think about this? What might he say? Now, those of you who know something about Abraham Kuyper know that if he were here, he would probably try to tell us what we should all think rightly about things. That's not what I'm here to do. But he was a very strong personality. But it's also important to note this. Though a strong personality, he was not in any way a poster child of totalitarianism or intolerance. Even though you can find the language in Kuyper where he says that he wanted the Netherlands to eventually one day to be run according to the ordinances of God, he did not want this to happen in a totalitarian way. He wanted this to happen in a persuasive way. And even when he was prime minister, it was not his goal as prime minister to run the Netherlands as some kind of Christian totalitarian nation. This is not at all what he did. What I want to do briefly is I do want to note what I call some Kuyperian impulses that I think resonate with what Miroslav has shared with us. And it's out of these that I think it also supports the idea of how you can have people who are exclusivist in their faith, yet they are also certainly willing to have a politically pluralistic environment. So the first is, surprise, surprise to those of you who know Kuyper, his doctrine of sphere sovereignty. Now, I'm not going to assume everybody knows what sphere sovereignty is. For Kuyper, it's an idea that he clearly articulates when he gives the rectorial address, the inaugural address for the Free University of Amsterdam in 1880. And part of what he's doing in that address is he's trying to make the case for why you can have, in the Netherlands, a confessional university. So he articulates this idea of sphere sovereignty, which basically says that there's God who's sovereign over everything, and from that sovereignty, there's derivative sovereignties in the various structures of society. So there's a sovereignty of politics, of business, of education, of church, etc. What that means is that none of those domains can tell the other ones how they ought to do things. But what he was also making the case for was that even within those various structures, that you could have what some call a worldview pluralism. So not just one kind of Reformed person, but Christians, Catholics, secular, etc. Out of that idea of sphere sovereignty, you have already an impulse for having a context of political pluralism. So that's one way to get to political pluralism out of a Kuyperian way of looking at things, through sphere sovereignty. A second way comes from a larger theological impulse, and that is you have a strong creation-affirming theology in Abraham Kuyper. In this creation-affirming theology, one of the objectives is certainly that Christians are to participate in the created order and lead it to its flourishing. There's an affirmation of the ongoing goodness of the creation, though it's fallen. What also then follows from that sense of goodness is also the goodness of all human beings. Now, Kuyper, he believed in total depravity like many Reformed people do. But nonetheless, this creational affirmation is itself also a basis for how you're going to treat all human beings. So if you have a society, you can't have a society then where one of your objectives is to then be religiously oppressive of other people. So flowing out of that goal of seeking the flourishing of creation, which itself flows out of that creation-affirming theology, you have this strong commitment that I think helps also have a political pluralism. Another way to think of it is to say this. When Christ is asked about what the two greatest commandments are, so he repeats the first one, which is a positive affirmation of the first table, when he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if you're loving your neighbor as yourself, I mean, what's part of the impulse for loving your neighbor as yourself? That creational affirmation that I'm talking about. If you're loving your neighbor as yourself, then this also sets the stage for having a context of political pluralism rather than a context of political repression. A third thing is something that flows out of a tension that people see in Abraham Kuyper, a tension between what I like to call the thing that gives you an approach of distinctive public engagement. And here's why I call it distinctive public engagement. In Kuyper, you have, on the one hand, the impulse from common grace. I like to say that common grace is basically the permission Christians have, though the world has fallen, to continue to participate in every area of life because God is preserving the creation. And then, while he's preserving the creation, then Christians still have the possibility of obeying the first command to seek the flourishing of creation. That's my way of articulating the cultural mandate there. Common grace says the creation is still yours in which to participate, so you should get out there. Get in the game, so to speak. So common grace is your permission. Get out there and do it. But Kuyper also articulated the antithesis. And when he articulates the antithesis, he talks about the fact that Christians are distinctive people. So while he's saying, get out there, he's also saying, remember who you are. So that's distinctive public engagement. But that distinctive public engagement, because you've got the emphases of both common grace and getting out there in the public, and you're saying remember who you are, at one level, it's already telling you that you're going to be in a pluralistic domain to begin with. So I think living in the tension between common grace and antithesis itself also sets the stage for having a context where Christians can be, again, exclusivist, but affirm a pluralistic, politically pluralistic society. And there are two others. One is the fact that Christians should have a disposition of humility even as they seek God's best in the world. Now, for all the fact that Kuyper was a very strong personality, I mean, you just listen to, just read some stories sometime about when he came to America and the ways that he talked to the people he visited, and you'll see what I'm saying. But for all of that, he recognized that no matter how great he thought his ideas were, that his ideas did not encapsulate all of knowledge. So you've got to have humility in the face of your own limitations. If you have those limitations, you recognize that no matter how excited you might be about seeking God's best in the world, you just don't know everything. You don't know all the answers. You don't know the best strategies. If you really acknowledge that, then you have to have a disposition of humility about how you're going about this. If you have that disposition about humility, it's kind of hard to be totalitarian if you have that kind of humility. So, we still see through, an opaque glass, right? We still see darkly. So, humility. And then finally this. That's what I'm calling eschatological restraint. People often talk about Kuyper and eschatology, so this is me sort of drawing an implication out of Kuyper. Though Kuyper wanted transformation, he was not ultimately a triumphalist. This is very important. He wanted transformation, but he couldn't be a triumphalist. And if you think about how he became prime minister, he becomes a prime minister through a coalition with the Catholics, for example. Okay? So he doesn't have a certain kind of reformed triumphalism about him. So regardless of what one hopes for with Christ coming and setting everything right, In the meantime, we have to live in a way where that humility I just talked about disposes us to live as truly hopeful people, but not hopeful people who think, okay, I can read the tea leaves all around me. I can tell you exactly what we need to think about everything. I can tell you exactly how it's all going to wrap up. And because I can tell you that, then I can start being very sure about pretty much everything I have to say, politically, culturally, etc. No. While we hope, we also recognize that basically, until Christ comes and sets things right, we're going to be in a pluralistic context. And in the meantime, what we need to do is, in that pluralistic context, be those committed to living at peace with others. If you have that commitment to living with peace and having that eschatological restraint, that's a disposition that certainly facilitates, while one may be an exclusivist theologically, one is going to be a pluralist politically. Thanks.
Okay, let me open by thanking Professor Volf for his paper, and in particular for his nuanced account of the nature of pluralism. These, as Vincent was suggesting, these sorts of discussions are familiar to the principled pluralist tradition that the Center for Public Justice has long been part of and long advocated. And it is a real delight to receive this new articulation. So thank you for that. What I hope to do, and I'll try to do this quickly, is to make a few points from my perspective as a Christian political theorist. One of my main questions as I listened to Professor Volf tonight, and also as I made my way through Public Faith, his book, earlier this week, is how we would put together a theory of the state and a theory of politics that understands pluralism in this way. So I'm going to offer some of my thoughts in that respect. My sense, my hope, moreover, is that as I do so, Professor Volf may see some ways that the Christian tradition of pluralist political thought can in turn speak back into his own project as he continues to work through these complex questions. I have three main sets of questions, and I'll briefly outline them. I think it'll become clear how they relate to one another. First, a note on pluralism and liberalism. Second, a note on the nature of the state. And third, a note on our calling as speakers and listeners in a democratic society. So on the first note, a note on pluralism and liberalism, let me say that I find myself very much at home in Volf's model of political pluralism. In the book, he uses the term a consocial model, which is a term I believe he borrows from Nick Wolterstorff, particularly in reaction to strong liberal positions concerning politics. And by liberal, I mean the liberal tradition, John Locke, not Hillary Clinton liberal. We're talking the large liberal tradition, particularly in reaction to strong liberal positions concerning politics. I have found this call for a genuinely pluralist politics to be very compelling. Because it establishes a political vision that seeks to disestablish liberalism without establishing anything else. And so this is a view that emphasizes, quote, speaking in one's own voice, which is a section heading in one of Professor Volf's chapters in that book. What I want to emphasize, however, is that this is a very strong claim to make. In the version of political exclusivism that is dominant today, and that is the tradition of political liberalism, there are rules concerning the contributions that people might make in the political space. And, well, more specifically, rules concerning the acceptable grounds for political participation. So just to be clear, it should be emphasized that political exclusivism, as has been outlined, it has a long history. It's entrenched, really, in how we understand the state today. In fact, this is by far the dominant way that states have been justified theoretically, which is what makes the example of Roger Williams so remarkable. The idea is that political authority, to be legitimate, is based upon a moral or philosophical truth that is widely shared in society. Our modern liberal societies, our contemporary societies, are no different in that respect. And you can just look at the history of early liberalism to see how this develops. Emerging out of the wreckage of the religious wars of Western Europe, early liberals sought to find a new foundation for the state, now that organized religion clearly was not going to work. And so they found a new commonness in the new Enlightenment ideals of liberty, equality, and a high view of reason. So to contemplate a breakdown in that strong moral consensus that undergirds the state, that is to risk instability, maybe even violence. So the pluralist position that Professor Volf summarizes here and that the Center for Public Justice has long been advocating is therefore threatening and maybe a little subversive, because it threatens that, quote, community with a shared perspective version of politics. And at the very least, it may represent intolerable risk for many people. So my first challenge is to ask whether we have a good answer to this response. Can we sustain a claim that pluralist politics may actually bring stability rather than endanger stability? So that's that first question. A second note on the nature of the state. Here's my difficulty. Let's grant that we want to reject this view of the state as a community with a shared perspective in favor of the political pluralist view that we've been talking about. If it's true that we should not ground our politics in a shared philosophical or a shared theological commitment, well then, what is it precisely that holds our states together? While I have lived in the United States for a good 15 years, my citizenship is actually Canadian. This usually comes up in conversations. And most of you will know that every generation or so, Canada comes close to breaking apart. It's this habit. There's a certain constitutional insecurity at work. And so Canadians are only too familiar with concerns about the durability and the nature of the ties that bind the country together. And a generation ago, one of Canada's leading theorists posed the question this way: is Canadian unity to be supported by anything more than, quote, a tenuous willingness to coexist? Right? Is that all that is going to bind our state together if we lose this common basis at the heart of the state? Another way to ask the question is, in a world after liberalism, which is what the world is starting to look like, in a world that seeks to move beyond establishing or privileging any religious group or any moral philosophy, what is it that brings us together into this moral space called politics? If it's not a strong moral consensus or a strong ideological or identity thing, then what is it that sustains our political order? Is there any there? Right? Now, I can imagine for myself all sorts of possible answers to that question, and I've begun to explore some of them, but of course I'm very interested to hear what Professor Volf might say on this. How do we understand the state? How do we understand the political in the world of a pluralist politics? So that's the second question. Okay, my last question. Well, the short form of the question might be stated this way: how shall we then speak? What I'm wondering is, given this account of pluralist societies that Professor Volf has outlined, what are the ethics of open political engagement? So it's sort of an ethical sort of question. How shall we behave in this strange new pluralist world? What are our responsibilities, both as people who hear and as people who speak? So I'm interested, I think, and this is how as I was struggling with this, I'm interested in what we might call pluralist virtues. So for instance, as people who listen when we enter into the public space, it would seem to me that we cannot insist upon a certain mode of argument or a certain conception of reason as a condition for speaking with us. That is, we cannot require fellow participants in the political dialogue to borrow a language that is not their own in order to speak to us. So I think that might be a political virtue for listeners. Now, does this go further? In a politically pluralist society, can we discount the political merits of a particular position merely because it is premised upon different grounds than our own? I have ideas. I'm not sure. I'm not even sure I understood the question. Can we discount the political merits of a particular position merely because it's premised upon different grounds than our own view? Okay, that's from the perspective of people who listen. As people who speak when we enter into politics, I'd be interested to know if, in a pluralist society, we might believe that there is an obligation to include one's motivating reasons as we make an argument. In other words, as you make a political argument in the public square, do you have an obligation to say how you arrived at that argument in order to be fully authentic or sincere? Or how about the reverse? If we are making an argument based entirely upon an unshared religious view, is there some sort of obligation to make clear the political implications of that religious view? So, for example, a pro-life person might, in a political discussion, cite Psalm 139. I am fearfully, wonderfully made. You knit me together in my mother's womb. Full stop. Is that enough? Or does that person, to be a virtuous citizen, need to go further and unpack how we get from that text to where to what we are arguing in our political position? So I'd be interested in those sort of questions. How shall we behave? What are the rules for living in this pluralist world when we enter into politics? I think that as we follow this line, we'll need even to consider a deeper question, and that is, as we consider the nature of our obligations in a politically pluralist society, what is the source of these ethical obligations? What is it that imposes these obligations upon us? We might say the source is simply whatever faith the participant holds. That may be, but it will be hard to establish common rules if everyone's obligations are understood to be different according to whatever faith they have. Well then, may we say more? Perhaps we could say that these obligations are understood as being part of the nature of the political itself as a distinct sphere of normative discourse. If so, then once again, I think we're going to face the task of how do we define the political in this pluralist world, while at the same time affirming the reality of a pluralist politics. How do we define the political? What's our theory of the state? Well, I think that's all. Those 3 points are part of a central question for me, developing a Christian political theory of political pluralism. And I think as liberalism becomes less and less persuasive, the truth of what Professor Volf has laid out will become more and more clear. But at the same time, it's also going to become clear just how much more work we've all been given to try to figure this all out. So.
Thanks. I am not a theologian, and I am not a theorist. I am a simple lawyer, and I need answers to particular problems. Now, I've been a fan of this way of thinking for a very long time. I've been a fan of Miroslav Volf's work and the Center for Public Justice and Abraham Kuyper. And I'm going to start tonight with a question that my students ask when we talk about this stuff. And that's, how do we actually do it? You know, what happens if you believe in pluralism of structures. Family is not a state. The state is not a church. The church is not a business. And you believe in a plurality of worldviews, but there's a competing perspective on what the vision of the good is. What does the state do? Do you go with the majority? What happens if you've got a competing understanding of what a family is? How do you answer that question? Well, it's a very good question. I can't answer it as much as I would like to tonight. All I can really do is offer an observation, and I want to highlight a group of people that I think Christians are going to have to engage with in a different way over the course of the next 2 decades, right? So here's my observation. I grew up in a suburb of Chicago in the 1960s and 70s, and everybody that I knew, male, female, Democrat, Republican, everybody was in favor of gun control. Why? Because guns are very dangerous things. They kill people. You have to regulate them. We didn't really talk about it. This is what we believed. When I moved to Spokane, Washington to teach at Whitworth, right? So Spokane is on the eastern side of the state, right next to Idaho. All of my students, male, female, Democrat, Republican, all of them loved their guns. They were so attached to their guns. And I thought they were crazy. I couldn't understand it. We couldn't talk about the Second Amendment. We could not talk about gun control. This went on for years. I didn't understand them. Then, when I was 47, okay, this is 5 years ago, I had 2 students who had been in the military. And for my birthday, they took me to a gun range, okay? Here's the thing. You would never guess this, but I am so good at it. I could do perfect double taps, first time out, 10 in a row, right? Head to the chest, head to the chest. I was amazing. I love this. I love my gun. I have a 9mm pink Beretta. They're going to have to pry it out of my cold, dead hands, right? So what's my point? My point is that our perspective, our experience changes our perspective on policy, right? Our experience, even when you're old, even when you're 47, our experience can change our perspective on politics. Now, to highlight the group that I want to talk about the gay and lesbian community that includes brothers and sisters in Christ. I think that we are at the beginning of at least 20 years of public policy debate that involves the tensions within 2 different amendments to the Constitution. Okay? On the one hand, we've got the First Amendment, religious liberty, freedom of religion, which includes the ability of institutions, faith-based institutions, to define themselves according to their own worldview. On the other hand, we have the 14th Amendment, which includes equal protection and due process of fundamental rights, and this is the amendment that the gay and lesbian community use for rights claims. Now, how do these 2 come into tension with each other? The first thing you're going to think about is same-sex marriage, right? But that is just the tip of the iceberg, because underneath this issue is the question of what is the family. And what is the family impacts immigration law, health care, housing law. It impacts employment. And then we're talking about who's going to preach in our churches and who's going to teach in our schools. And if you imagine that you have a faith-based business, this is an actual case in the courts, a faith-based business, Christian photographer, who doesn't want to hire people who are gay and also does not want to have people who are gay as customers. Should the law allow that? Should the law allow the self-definition of a faith-based institution to that kind of extent? Okay, we are just at the beginning of decades of this kind of discussion. And I believe that as we enter into the discussion, we have to know each other because our experience will impact the way we think about public policy. When I talk to gay and lesbian groups, I say, you have to get to know the religious community. You have to understand why they want to define their institutions the way that they do. And I say the same to Christian communities. You have to know the gay community. You can't just know a person who is gay. We have to know families of gay couples that are raising children. We have to understand how they raise their children. We have to arrange our institutions in such a way that people who are among us who are gay feel comfortable talking to us about the challenges that they face. When we know them, when our experience with them is such that we understand the challenges that they face, we will be better able to ask the question, what does it mean to love this community? And we have to do this if we're going to lead into the next 2 decades of public policy debates. These debates are going to happen. So we have to have an understanding and a well-thought-through, pluralistic way of figuring out how we're going to balance these different kinds of rights. Now, a couple of weeks ago, the magazine Comment magazine, put out by Cardis in Canada, had an article called Kuyper the Mystic. Okay, and those of us who know Kuyper think of him as a public theologian. But this article pointed out that Kuyper's point often was that if you are a Christian and you want to do politics in a pluralistic way, you can only engage culture if you also know God. You have to know God. He was quite firm about this. Kuyper knew God through piety and personal devotion. There are also other ways to know God. I have been working with a group of Whitworth students who are developing relationship with street kids in the city of Spokane. So Spokane sits between Seattle, up in the north, Seattle and Minneapolis. Seattle and Minneapolis have have gang problems that Spokane doesn't have quite so much of. So we are a hospitable place for kids to run to from those 2 cities. There are between 1,500 and 2,000 teenagers living on the streets in abandoned homes in our city. These kids have had a rough life. Many of them are gay. That's why they got kicked out of their homes or why they ran away from home in the first place. Many of them have been sexually assaulted, and many of them, for a wide variety of complicated reasons, have prostituted themselves. Now, they are distrustful of me. They don't like me, but they love our college students. So on this one day, they were all playing football. The college students and the street kids were playing football. And I was making hamburgers. And next to me on the picnic table sat this student. He's a big guy. He was a football player, really just someone I didn't know very well. He was sitting there, and his whole face was wet with tears. And I said to him, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I've been a Christian my whole life. I read the Bible, I go to Bible study, I pray, but I do not know God." He said, "When I look at the faces of these kids, I see Jesus in their faces." Okay, so my hope for us, for all of us, as we do public policy into the coming decades, that we work really hard to see Jesus in the face of the people who will be impacted by our policy. Thanks.
So we've had some great thoughts tonight, and now we'd like to hear a few things from you. We're going to open it up for some questions. I'm going to give you a couple house rules, though, for our conversation tonight. First, I'd ask that you would wait for one of the students who has the baton of power to bring the microphone to you. For the sake of the recording, please speak into the microphone. Second, I'd ask that you'd introduce yourself, just by your name is fine, before you ask your question. And I would ask that your brief question be phrased in the form of a brief question.
Russ Bishop. I have a question about the use of the term liberal to describe the context within which you want this pluralism to be sort of carried out. Isn't it more useful to use the term secular? Most of the literature that I read that's wrestling with the question of what to do in a pluralistic society when you have atheists, agnostics, Mormons, the whole gamut, and how you live in that kind of a pluralistic environment, tend to use the term secular as a kind of just a pragmatic way of trying to solve the problem. Liberalism, I mean, many in the religious camp would identify themselves as liberal. I think of Peter Berger, who talks about his experience of moving to the left theologically and to the right conservatively, but he now would identify as a liberal. So I'm just wondering if that might be the more appropriate question. And then just a follow-up in terms of secular, to think of it in terms of worldview. I mean, what should be the response of people who espouse a religious view to what Charles Taylor calls exclusive humanism, which essentially is a more radical kind of worldview, secularism, which questions any and all supernatural religious view? Where do they fit in this sort of scheme of a pluralistic society?
Well, the second part, it seems to me, of your question, namely, where do the exclusive secularists fit? They fit exactly where everybody else fits. At least that's what I would argue. I wouldn't go with the father of political liberalism, John Locke, and exclude them as not quite morally facile enough, right? So it seems to me that would, if I understood your question, that's where I would go with it. I'm not sure what the best term is. I tend to speak of the neutral state, right? Or actually, I tend to use Nick Walterstorff's interpretation of the neutral state as an impartial one, all right? So because secular has got this. While what you suggest is in line with the way in which secular has been originally used in the political and sociological literature, today overwhelmingly it has a kind of worldview connotations. And I think it might be a confusing term, but I think there are other folks here who might know better, like Paul would be a great person to respond.
I usually use the word liberal just because it's more specific. And I tend not to equate the terms because secular, I think, secular worldviews are worldviews that, like Christianity and like Islam or others, are sometimes are required by strong versions of liberalism to find their own home within the liberal pluralist world. And some of them quite resent that in the same way that other other religions might resent the place that liberalism places them. So I think then liberalism claims to present a model of pluralism that I think is itself the problem. So that's why I tend to use that term. I'm following very much Rawls's understanding of what liberalism and his account of how liberalism works in society. So that's part of what's betraying my usage.
Thank you. My name is Josh. All four of you made me think of this brief question. Particularly Dr. Brink's excellent articulation of the struggle he has with Professor Volf's thesis, which I'm sympathetic to. And I wonder why there was no discussion of an element of personalism in all its varieties, particularly Catholic personalism, as being the foundation at which we find these pluralistic virtues, that's the way the exclusivists come to agreement. That's the overlapping consensus, to use Rawls' term. I'm not totally convinced of my own answer, but I'm wondering if that element of personalism might be a direction to go with teasing this out.
You want to touch I'm going to let you go first all the
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
People are here to hear you, see you.
Go ahead.
Maybe I'm interested in looking at that, and I find much to admire, and I draw much inspiration on that. I just haven't really begun to do the work. Where I've gone for myself largely is to look at deeper and more reflections on what it means to be created in the image of God. Those of you who have been attending this conference will find that in like many of the papers and the plenary discussions, there's been constant references to what it means to be created in the image of God. And so I'm persuaded that's something that I need to do more and deeper thinking about. And so that's probably the route I would pursue.
You know, I'm Vince can speak maybe of this, but I tend to think for myself on this issue very much in the line of common grace, and it would seem to me that I also don't have a particular stake in making a claim that all religions are different in all regards, and even all religions are different in all important regards. I think that religions are different, but they're also in many areas the same. They're overlapping, right? So that it's not the case that you have these completely separate concentric circles of intelligibility among religions and secular worldviews, but rather you have them as overlapping and shifting in their overlapping character over periods of time, which is to say then that something like the commonality, even though each of us thinks out of our own traditions, nonetheless, we always already think, especially if we think in terms of common grace, we always already think out of the space of the overlap of the commonalities, right? Even as different. And to me, that provides then a kind of formal ground. We have to then explicate and think concretely what it means that common ground exists. For instance, I was trying to do that in the book Allah. I was trying to make an argument which was not so much soteriological argument, but political argument or ethical, moral argument, that there is a sufficient overlap in Muslim and Christian convictions about God, and therefore moral convictions as well, even though the two are completely distinct religions. And I think some similar relationship obtains among other religions and even worldviews, and that presumably can be argued for and not just asserted as a theological claim, and that to me would provide the moral basis. Whether that would be sufficient to provide a basis for a theology of the state or of the political remains to be seen. But that's the direction in which I would be headed.
Thank you. Lauren Bartold. I have a question for Professor Volf. First of all, I thought your lecture was very clear and was very fascinated by your reference to Roger Williams. And I was wondering if you could bring us up to date a little bit from Roger Williams to our present context. For example, from where I stand, I don't see too many people on the far right, too many Christians, I mean, I know there are probably some, but on the far right who are working to prohibit Jews from worshiping on Sabbath and Muslims from worshiping, etc. It seems like more along the lines, actually, questions that Paul raised and even the last commentator. The issue is, how do we translate our religious belief into the public square? So the tension today is not so much religious practices, pluralism of religious practices, but the public-private tension. So is my belief in Psalm 139 and trying to enact a law based on that, is that a religious practice? So I was wondering if you could comment on that. What might an example look like, or how do you understand that pluralism given the public-private tensions today?
I agree with you. I don't think we can simple freedom of religious observance. I think won't do, but it won't do partly also because it has kind of isolated it has split the two tables of the law as if the second table of the law were not religious duties. They were kind of common human duties, and duties toward God were specifically religious duties. That's a really artificial way of putting things when it comes to the way people of faith think. It would seem to me that you have to look at it as a kind of the total package of the life before God, and then the question of Psalm 139 as a religious duty. It's my human. If I built my case as a supporter of that life begins from the conception to as a supporter of that view, I can. It's my religious view as well as human view, and I'm not sure exactly that I can distinguish carefully between these two. But so the debates slightly have shifted, but nonetheless, there are debates about religious convictions which are not simply private ones, right? How one draws the line between the two private and public. I mean, you can draw the line on the religious side of things, right? Religions are simply a private things that you have. And freedom of religion. I had great freedom of religion in the communist Yugoslavia if I were going to take my religion as being a private affair, right? So the question of this where the line between private and public is drawn is a fundamental one.
One other element I think is important with that is how if you have religious convictions, you're going to do a job of translation. So that if you're using Psalm 139, well, everyone doesn't know what Psalm 139 says, or what that means for you. So you're making some kind of public case for why this religious conviction, or at least starts as a religious conviction for you, why it has public import, and why you can, and why for you this ought to be influential for shaping policy. So. I mean, I think it's an ongoing challenge for Christians to get better at doing that. I mean, to me, I think that's part of the challenge. Is because is it necessarily that if it's religious, if a religious conviction is at the basis of it, does that mean that it's really strictly a private thing? That it should stay private? Because the fact is that everyone's got some worldview dimension that's going to be playing a role in forming how they're arriving at their ideas and what they're going to support publicly. It's not like there's just these public ideas out there, and then we all have commit together to keep these core convictions sort of in the private world. It's just which ones we decide that we want to either admit in the public or which ones we're doing a better job of translating in the public. So I think you have to think about that dimension as well.
Can I? Okay. Again, from a perspective where you take a problem and you address a problem in a community, I do a lot of mediation in the public school arena where there are faith-based groups of people who want their worldview to come into the public square in a public school setting, and there are other people who are saying, no, this is a public setting, we keep religion out of it, we have to, and I grew up in a tradition that's Christian Reformed, Calvinist. We always thought of ourselves as distinct from others, right? And when you approach something by saying, I am distinct from you, you will have a huge fight. But when I work with these communities, we spend 3 days building up what we have in common, trying really hard not to use labels, but what we have in common. It is amazing to me how relatively straightforward way we can reach compromise that is satisfying to the whole group. And so I think that staying away from labels and trying to build what you have in common with others is an easier way to approach policy.
I was just going to say that, I can affirm most of the things that are being said up here. Just the verb translate is one that I react against a little bit. It's not so much that I want to say take Psalm 139 and to translate it into public. Rather, let's consider what the political implications are. So we're sort of taking it further rather than translating it into a public tongue. We're considering its political implications. And that's, I think, when Psalm 139 people and the Quran people and the Communist Manifesto people they have their sacred texts, and then they come together into the public space in the public school, and they begin to find the common ground coming out of that. That's when things can happen.
Thank you. My name is John Brandkamp. Thank you, Dr. Volf, and all of the others for speaking tonight. There are so many things, obviously, that can be spoken of. But one item in particular at the very end when you spoke, Dr. Strongs, was about your work with the homeless. I worked in New York City for several years with the homeless on Staten Island and Lower Manhattan at the ferry terminal. And the population, the demographics of that population are very, very familiar to me. And so I can't tell you how much I appreciate your bringing this into the discussion of how we do our politics, because we need to incorporate the Imago Dei. And just as I mentioned just last night or the night before, that our Christian life needs to be kind of a kenosis kind of political life, where we serve others for their benefit, and that is our witness to Christ by being Christ-like to them. So just one item of a book that I think you may know about or not is Andrew Marin's book, Love is an Orientation, about his work with the gay and lesbian community in Chicago. And then a classic that all of you reminded me of is Lewis's Abolition of Man, where he speaks of the Tao of these different traditions of worldviews and yet all of the common grounds that they have in terms of justice and love of family and the rights and the wrongs that we all share as human beings. So that is something that kind of got reinforced for me, is this idea of being religiously, fairly exclusivist, but profoundly politically inclusive, because of that very sense that we have this shared Imago Dei. So anyway, not a question, just a thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for these presentations. I do have this quick question, which is a very pragmatic one. Coming to the United States as somebody who grew up in Ghana, spent some time in former communist world, I was quite surprised to see in a church setting, when it's coming for the election season, where on one hand you do have some Christians emphasizing the right wing in the American political spectrum, and then you have the left. And on a pastoral level, I found it very, very stressful. I'm very glad that this election coming up, I'm not in a pastoral role. My question is this, because I do find very good Christians on the right and very good Christians on the left. How are these proposals you are making for us to consider fit in this political spectrum that we operate in right here in the United States?
I take it that one of the virtues that we ought to develop is one of the democratic virtues, is the virtue of honoring everyone. And what that concretely always means is not clear, and maybe it's not specifiable in advance. And maybe there are not also rules as to what exactly it means to honor. They're kind of pointers rather than rules. But I think it would seem to me that, we often tend to be first members of this or that particular group, and actually then Christians. And we've seen it, you've been in former Yugoslavia, we've seen it when Yugoslavia split into two. And suddenly, no matter what people were saying, you could just see there were first Serbs and first Croats, and Christianity was an add-on and actually placed in the service of being a Serb and a Croat. A kind of a sense that, and in a sense, it's understanding of faith as monolatry, right? Henotheism. It's not monotheism, right? It's not that belief in the one God of all people, and therefore of Croats and Serbs, and therefore of Republicans and of Democrats. It's the God on your side, the God in the Croatians, right? And the heavenly Serbia, to use a vocabulary that's familiar in our region, right? But has its resonances, I think, in a different way here. And that's why I think that the first political duty of Christians is to be Christians. I think Karl Barth was exactly right on this point, to be the followers of Christ, to be the followers of crucified Christ who gave his life for the ungodly. If we need some translation, it's this kind of attitude that needs to be translated into concrete actions in the settings in which we find ourselves.
I'd also add that in the United States, the vote for president gets all the attention. Are you going to vote for the Republican or vote for the Democrat? But that vote is such a small piece of being political. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying that to emphasize to those that we all talk with, the way we spend our money is political, the way we engage with others is political, the way we work in our cities is political, and there this Democrat candidate, Republican candidate is. That bifurcation exists at a lower level.
Jack Davis, and question for Dr. Volf and maybe Professor Stronson. The question is, I think you've made a very plausible case that we're on a trajectory toward greater political pluralism. And my question is, from the point of view of a Christian voting or of a Christian legislature, does that trajectory basically wind us up? Should we be libertarian in our political philosophy? In other words, I guess the question is, on what basis would we ever vote, either individually or as a legislature, to restrict another citizen's moral choices, in terms of sexual ethics, abortion, gay rights, or whatnot? And does this really land us in a libertarian political theory, and also a view of knowledge that basically says unless secular social science can demonstrate a harm, we don't vote to restrict another citizen's freedom? In other words, do we, in effect, as Christians, do we act like libertarians, even if we aren't libertarians?
Okay. I'll just say my opinion, and you can throw potatoes at me. I absolutely not libertarian in the same sense of not democratic. I mean, not Democrat, not Republican. I think that those labels are unhealthy kinds of labels. I think a different way of framing your question is, what is the role of government? Not let's be libertarian and not restrict anybody, but is there a legitimate role of government? And then if we think about what are some things that we can agree that a legitimate role of government might be, well, one, to protect us from harm, another to preserve a certain kind of order. So when I talk with students about this, we always talk about the purpose of law. Is a Christian understanding of law just the harm principle? No, it includes the harm principle, but then if you're going to move beyond the harm principle, you do have to do that in consultation with a lot of other people. And that scares me because it can very easily turn into a super majoritarian approach, which is why I think when we look at minorities in our community, especially people who have been on the hurt side of policy, we have to be very, very careful in passing laws that are going to make losers out of a certain group over and over. But I do understand the libertarian bend.
I suppose what I was after would be probably exactly opposite of libertarianism. But not exactly opposite, right? But not. But I mean, the basic idea is you nurture your own moral sensibilities within communities, who, in the process of nurturing those, are obviously in conversation with many others. You, in churches, proclaim about it, you teach your children about your moral convictions, and you bring to public domain your moral convictions. Whatever views you and your community has. The basic idea is, basically that's how I understand Nick Walterstorff's consocial position, right? Consocial position is I don't speak out of some presumed a common thin agreement. I can speak out of thick convictions of my own community, and I don't need an account of my own intelligibility in the wider realm in order to be allowed to speak. That would exclude, I don't know how many people, philosophically untrained and so forth. I mean, it'll create a mess out of political system, I think, if something like that was a stricture. So my sense is we need to, that's what I'm after as a political pluralism, a genuine possibility of each community bringing their own perspectives on life and living with consequences of it. Sometimes you gain, sometimes you lose. Remember that I ended my talk with religious right, of which I'm not one, I repeat. Religious right being for me a legitimate legitimate articulator of religious exclusivism that is politically pluralistic. That seems to me, it's a good thing. Actually, the very last point that I was going to make, and I never came to writing it, which I will when it comes to soon, and that is, I'll include it in this chapter, in this text. That is, I want to write, why are religious exclusivists good for globalization? I think religious exclusivists are good for public, for the common good, especially for the common good in the globalized world, in which you have to have, in any case, but particularly there, you have to have sturdy convictions if you're going to move and make change. And they bring to fore some of the fundamental issues, which I would describe as account of self, social relations, and the good. And even when I disagree with a particular kind of religious exclusivist, I still think it's an important contribution to the common good that those issues are being brought to fore, discussed, and resistances are being placed against what I think is probably the most insidious some of the most insidious developments that we are undergoing, namely a kind of mindless seeking for consumerist-defined pleasures that do not end up to life well lived, but keep us enthralled by the whole stream of new products that come at our way, and we forget what it means to be a human being, what it means to relate well to others, what it means to pursue good. Against these forces, I think religious exclusivists, even those with whom I radically disagree, can be a help.
I think we could probably talk all night, and I know there's a lot of other questions, but I also know there's a lot of people who drove here from Boston and other places far, and we did commit to keep you till 9 o'clock. So I'd like us to thank Dr. Volf and our respondents again.